Hi everyone, and welcome back to History Calling, where I bring you new videos every Friday delving into the events of the past. Today's offering works both as a standalone video and as a sequel to the previous two, in which I looked at the beheading of Henry VIII's second wife Anne Boleyn in 1536 and the double execution in 1542 of her sister-in-law Jane Boleyn and cousin Katherine Howard, who was also Henry's fifth wife. Those videos are linked in the description box if you'd like to see the entire trilogy I've rather inadvertently ended up creating. I promise I'll give you something more upbeat next week. I just got sucked into the execution topic. All three women number among the many burials in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. And today we're going to learn what happened when the Victorians realised they would have to start digging up Anne Boleyn and those buried near her because the building was in serious need of restoration work. Using a published account written by one of the excavators, I'm going to reveal the condition Anne's bones were in when they were recovered, what this can tell us about her appearance, and even a physical trait she shared with her daughter Elizabeth I. I'll also be discussing what was left of some of the other prominent Tudor figures buried in this chapel, including Catherine and Jane. We'll consider the evidence that there was at least one other disinterment of these bones before the Victorians got there, and discuss how likely or unlikely it is that any further examination of these people's remains will ever occur. If you're new here, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel with notifications switched on. You can also find me over on Instagram under the username History Calling, for which I'll leave a link in the description box. The current chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula dates largely from the reign of Henry VIII, after it was heavily damaged by fire in 1512 and had to be refurbished. By the 1860s it was unsurprisingly in need of some tender loving care, and in 1876 Queen Victoria approved restoration work being carried out on the building. One of the men involved in this work was the secretary to Victoria's Privy Purse, named Doyne Courtney Bell. It's his account of what was done upon which this video is based. His book, entitled Notices of the Historic Persons Buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, is freely available online and linked below. Bell writes that upon examining the chapel, it quickly became obvious to all involved that the first thing which would need to be done was to level off and stabilise the floor, under which many people, some famous, some not, had been buried over the centuries. This constant digging and redigging had resulted in visible sinking in some areas, and there were also sanitary considerations, presumably a reference to the fact that most of the burials were in very shallow graves. At first, the restoration team had no intention of disturbing the remains of Anne, her brother George, executed 2 days before her, his wife Jane, and Queen Catherine, or any of the others who were interred near the altar at the head of the church. Instead, they hoped simply to place new paving stones over the old. However, Bell writes that as it turned out, this was practically impossible, as in 2 places the pavement had sunk and showed signs of considerable hollowness beneath it. It was therefore decided that the pavement must be removed in order that this sinking might be rectified, but that as little disturbance of the ground as possible should take place. With this decision made, on the 9th of November 1876, work got underway in the spot where some of the chapel's most famous remains lay, starting with the spot where Anne Boleyn was believed to be. The excavation work ran smoothly and quickly. Using a map constructed from historic sources, the paving stones over the spot where Anne was supposedly buried were lifted, the ground beneath removed, and, sure enough, around 2 feet down, they discovered human bones. Unexpectedly, however, they weren't buried in their original order. Instead, says Bell, they had, for some reason or other, been heaped together into a smaller space. Clearly Anne's remains, which were initially buried in a wooden arrow chest, had been dug up before. Bell and his companions felt that the earth had not been disturbed for at least a century, noting that they reached this conclusion because, after another 2 feet of earth had been removed, they discovered the 1750 burial of a woman named Hannah Beresford. Bell believed, and I agree, that this seems the likeliest explanation available to us as to when and why Anne's bones were previously disturbed. Most excitingly of all, for all of you Anne fans out there, he included a description of the physical features of the skeleton believed to be that of the Queen. One of the other men present was the local government inspector, Dr. Frederick Murat, and it's his examination of the remains which Bell reiterates in his book. Murat declared the skeleton to belong to a woman between the ages of 25 and 30. This is a little on the young side for Anne, who was approximately 35, but I think we need to make allowances for the fact that this was a guess made in the 1870s and based on a visual inspection, without the benefit of modern technology. Of course, if you've seen my video on when Anne Boleyn was born, you'll know that there is some controversy on this point, with some arguing for a 1501 birth year and others for 1507. While I come down on the side of 1501 myself, I admit that the 1507 date does fit better with Murat's assessment of the skeleton. The deceased was of a delicate frame of body, and she had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull. This, writes Bell, bore witness to the Queen's little neck, a reference to a comment Anne made shortly before her death about how easy it would be for the executioner to take her head off. Elsewhere in the book, Bell reiterates some of these details and gives additional information, saying, "The bones of the head indicate a well-formed, round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square, full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." Building on these summaries, we then get the best description of exactly which bones survived at that point. It reads, "Frontal bone, tolerably complete, showing a forehead moderate in height and of fair breadth, orbits large, superciliary ridge straight. A large portion of the occipital bone in excellent preservation. 2 portions of both upper maxillary bones. Several portions of the parietal bones in good condition. Fragments of both temporal bones much eroded in external plate. Small portions of the ethnoid and sphenoid bones. Lower jaw, 2/3 perfect. The other third on the left side was broken off and not found. 8 teeth remaining in jaw, 4 more teeth found loose, they had just fallen out, all in excellent preservation. 1 molar tooth of left side was slightly decayed. The form of the head appears to have been round and the face of an oval shape, the forehead straight and ample and denoting considerable intelligence. The lower part of the face, judging from the form of the jaw, must have been moderately full with a somewhat square chin. Vertebrae, the atlas, very small, much eroded. 3 dorsal vertebrae, probably the first and third. 3 lumbar vertebrae, very perfect. The other vertebrae are much eroded. Judging from these vertebrae, her height might have been about 5 feet, or 5 feet 3 inches, not more. 4 ribs, tolerably perfect, the rest fragmentary in 52 pieces. Collarbone and clavicle, the left side perfect, a small portion of the right clavicle only remaining. 2 fragments of the head of the scapula left side. Judging from the curvature of the ribs, she must have had a deep and well-formed chest. 8 fragments of the pelvis, very much eroded, and the characters almost obliterated. Portions of both legs. The left thigh bone, in tolerably good preservation, though broken off above, is singularly delicate and well formed. Several portions of the tibia and fibula of both legs. Patella, kneecap, of left leg, very perfect. Her limbs evidently bore a due proportion to the rest of her body. Portions of the humerus and radius of the right side, the radius remarkably slender. Scaphoid bone of the right foot, and 11 bones of feet, all tarsal and metatarsal bones. 11 finger bones, phalanges. The middle metacarpal bone of the right hand and last bone of the little finger of left hand, very perfect. These bones showed a slender and delicate formation of the hands. 52 other fragments, very much eroded and not susceptible of exact identification. There are a few points I'd like to make about these descriptions. First, the use of the phrase an intellectual forehead and the later comment that her forehead denoted considerable intelligence are meaningless. This was part of the pseudoscience of phrenology, which was popular in the 19th century when this book was written. It was the theory that you could make judgments about an individual's intelligence and or personality based on the shape of their skull, but it's total rubbish and has long been debunked. Second, I think it's remarkable how well these observations match up with those made by Anne's contemporaries when describing how she looked in life, and this only helps to confirm for me that these really are her bones. Based on her skull, she had large eyes, and those who saw her in the 1520s and 30s remarked on how beautiful they were, even calling them her best feature. The oval face and square chin correspond with the only contemporary image we have of her, which is a portrait medal dating to 1534, while the Queen was described as being of middling height for the Tudor era, tallying nicely with the estimated height given here of between 5 feet and 5 feet 3 inches. You'll also note that there's no mention of a sixth finger, though admittedly only 11 finger phalanges were found, and there should have been 28. Speaking of her hands, the comments about the tapering and delicate fingers are interesting, as Elizabeth I was noted as having long fingers too, a trait she apparently shared with her mother. I do wonder where the rest of Anne's lower jaw and teeth had gone, as teeth are generally very hardy and slow to break down, but it's possible that she lost some in life, although I do think it would have been commented on had she been missing this many, or that whoever disinterred her prior to 1876 took some as gruesome souvenirs. Dr. Murat believed the bones had been in the ground for north of 300 years, which would fit with the time of Anne's death. However, unless they were buried with artifacts such as coins or a burial plate, I'm not sure that you can tell this without modern carbon dating equipment. If there are any archaeologists or forensic anthropologists listening who can shed some additional light on the question of dating burials, I'd love it if you would share your expertise with us in the comments section below, as this isn't my particular field. Dr. Murat also felt that the remains all belonged to one person, which I would think can be believed, as in most cases I would imagine that things like leg bones and arm bones will be the same size if they come from the same individual, and Bell's book specifically says that these bones were all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical. Crucially, the team found no other female bones in this area, and so, as well as their physical parameters matching what would be expected of Anne and the bones being found in the expected spot, there was no other contender to be her in the immediate area. In fact, the person nearest her was a large male of around 50 years of age, believed to be Edward VI's disgraced uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who was executed in 1552 in his early 50s. Bell also points out that as Anne and her brother George were the first burials in the chancel, the graves were in all probability dug to the right or dexter side of the altar, the so-called place of honour. This seems like an accurate assessment to me. If you recall when the bones of Richard III were found under a car park back in 2012, they were in a spot which had once been home to Greyfriars Church, and Richard had similarly been placed in a position of honour, in that case beneath the church's choir. George Boleyn's bones were not found, however, Bell felt that they might have been just outside the area which the restoration team were working on. Once Anne's remains had been recovered, they were placed in a box and left with Colonel Milman, who was then the resident governor of the Tower, until the time to reinter them came. 2 days later, the team began to work on another portion of the floor near the altar, this time expecting to find the remains of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who was Lady Jane Grey's father-in-law, Katherine Howard, Jane Boleyn, and Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Once again, 2 feet down, a skeleton was found, this time a male around 6 feet tall with a large skull and about 50 years of age. There was little doubt that this was the Duke of Northumberland, beheaded in 1553 in his late 40s. Nearby, the remains of 2 women were found close to one another, but in separate piles, and with many bones missing, having evidently been moved to the right of their original position at some point to accommodate the burial of 2 unknown individuals buried near the step of the chancel. One was a lady between 30 and 40 years of age, supposed to be Jane Boleyn, and whose bones indicated someone of rather delicate proportions. Another was a tall lady, much older, supposed to be the Countess of Salisbury, executed in 1541, aged 67. No bones thought to belong to Queen Katherine Howard were found, which Bell explained by saying, The bones at the age at which she was executed are softer in texture, and a great portion of them are more cartilaginous than when growth is completed and the framework of the body consolidated, so that they would disintegrate and disappear much more rapidly than had she been fully formed, and the whole process of ossification been completed. The large admixture of lime with earth which was found in the grave would accelerate this process. There is nothing therefore inconsistent with the fact of her having been buried there in the absence of any portion of her remains after a lapse of more than 3 centuries. This seems reasonable enough to me as an explanation, particularly as there were very few of Lady Salisbury's remains left, and Bell noted that some of what was there had been eroded by lime. That said, I'm not a medical doctor, and so if there's anyone listening who is a medical professional and can offer some additional information on the age at which bones solidify and how quickly they might break down in an earth burial, please let me know below. And just for the information of anyone who might be commenting on this point, Katherine was between 17 and 24 years old at the time of her death. Bell rules out the possibility that the bones assigned to Jane Boleyn were in fact Katherine, not just on the basis of age, but because Katherine was supposedly petite and the bones found seemed too large for her. I think this is a bit of a stretch, as we don't actually know the heights of Jane Boleyn and Katherine. However, the age and location of the bones is enough for me to be as confident as possible, without the advantage of DNA testing, that this woman was Jane Boleyn. Speaking more generally, I'm also pretty comfortable with the idea that Bell and his team correctly identified the rest of the bones they recovered in this area of the church. Apart from Catherine Howard and George Boleyn, all the bones expected to be found were located and in the places where it was anticipated they were buried, and they all matched the physical parameters of those people to whom they were supposed to belong. On the 13th of April 1877, with the restoration work complete, the remains which had been disinterred were brought back to the chapel. Bell records that these remains had been soldered up in thick leaden coffers and then fastened down with copper screws in boxes made of oak plank, 1 inch in thickness. Each box bore a leaden escutcheon, on which was engraved the name of the person whose supposed remains were thus enclosed, together with the dates of death and of the year, 1877, of the reinterment. The cases were then placed in the respective positions in the chancel in which the remains had been found, and the ground having been opened, they were all buried about 4 inches below the surface. The earth was then filled in, and concrete immediately spread over them. So could Anne, Jane, and the others be disinterred again? Well, theoretically, yes, though now that they're buried under concrete it would be harder to get at them. However, it's a moot point really, as the current monarch would have to give permission for this to be done, and this is very unlikely to happen, the modern royal family not wanting to set the precedent of allowing royals to be dug up and studied in case it happens to them. This is endlessly frustrating to those people who would like to see Anne and the others have a more formal burial, or who would love to have a facial reconstruction of Henry's second wife done. Indeed, a reconstruction would seem to be possible if the skull remains in the condition it was in 1877, but it may well have significantly degraded since then. Let's finish up then on a bit of a controversial question, which I'm sure will produce some interesting discussion in the comments. Do you think that the remains of Anne and the other victims of execution buried in the chapel should be disinterred again, potentially examined and reburied, or that they should be left where they are and undisturbed? I look forward to reading your thoughts. If you'd like some more Tudor history right away, why not check out my Tudor Monarchs and Six Wives of Henry VIII playlists, or for something different, might I suggest my video on the bizarre disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst. Whatever you select, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.